Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Hello everyone, welcome to the second lecture of this massive open online course on Sociology of Development. As you know, my name is Sambit Malik. I teach Sociology at the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences, Indian Institute of Technology, Guwahati. This is a 30-hour course spanning over 12 weeks, 3 months, starting from July to October 2021. In the first lecture, we provided a broad overview of sociology of development. If you look at the first week in terms of 2 lectures, we are going to capture historical location of the idea of development, and that's how we have started with how sociology of development refers to the application of social theory and analysis to societies, usually in the third world, which are undergoing a late transition of capitalist industrialization. And then we have discussed how sociology of development has been particularly concerned with analyzing the social effects of development on class relations on the one hand and social groups such as the peasantry and the urban poor on the other. And development studies emerged as a distinct area of research in the post-Second World War period and was associated with the growing concern for the political and economic development of the post-colonial world. The first sociological account of development, as we have discussed, was modernization theory. The modernization theory postulates that the less developed countries would eventually catch up with the industrialized world, the first world, the Western capitalist world, if they emulate the economic and social systems of Western capitalism. And as you slightly recall, in the first lecture itself, we have discussed this, how the modernization theory is largely based on the theoretical premises of structural functionalism. Society is based on the complementarity and reciprocity of roles in the social division of labor, creation and maintenance of structures and institutions of a capitalist economy. That's what structural functionalism is all about. And how modernization theory conceptualized development as a staged transition from tradition to modernity to be brought about at the economic level, at the social level, at the political level. We have discussed this, right? And then we have discussed how in the aftermath of the Second World War, how there was Cold War between the capitalist nations led by the United States of America and the socialist nations led by the erstwhile USSR, and motivated by the concern to challenge socialist ideas in the post-colonial world. The modernization theory was criticized for its optimism, oversimplification and ethnocentrism. We have discussed this. And subsequently what we have learned that against the orthodoxy of the United States of American model of development as well as European model of development, how those models of development, how they were challenged by the paradigms of Latin American development trajectory, African development trajectory and Asian development trajectory. Okay? I mean, for example, in the context of Latin American model of development, of underdevelopment, the modernization theory was displaced in the late 1960s and early 1970s as the most popular sociological analysis of development by the dependency approach. The dependency theory was in turn charged with oversimplification and with merely inverting the assumptions of the modernization theory. But subsequently what we come to know that criticism of these approaches such as modernization theory as well as dependency theory has left the sociology of development as a fragmented field in which various competing and more modest theories jostle for supremacy. And in recent years, there has been a growing awareness that the nation state cannot be analyzed in isolation from the international context, international political, economic, military contexts. And the field of sociology of development also has significant and growing overlaps with the sociological debates about globalization and the environment. I mean, the debates between development and environment and so on. There has also been a renewed analytic emphasis on the interdependency and integration among nations, not just in terms of economic processes, but also at the level of culture and ideology. That's how Serge Latouche argues that the concept of third world development is rooted in specifically Western ideas of technical progress and the accumulation of capital. That leads to development policies which destroy the cultures of non-Western populations. In particular, Latouche maintains that the drive towards global uniformity in cultures, lifestyles and mentalities has been responsible for endemic civil wars, ecological disasters and the widespread national debt throughout the world. And having discussed this in the first lecture, in this lecture we are going to situate development. We have to look at development historically. This is the second lecture of the first week, how development is fundamentally a process of change that involves the whole society, its economic, socio-cultural, political, physical structure, value system, as well as way of life of the people. Okay, when we look at a process of change, I mean development that encapsulates a process of change in its economic manifestations, in socio-cultural manifestations, political manifestations, in terms of physical structure, value systems and way of life. The process of development may be compared with the turning of a wheel in which each segment pushes the one ahead of it and is in turn pushed by the other behind. However, it is not yet clear which segment should be manipulated to put the wheel in motion. Okay? For example, if somebody suggests that no, our per capita income must first increase, then you will find our standard of education, our standard of health, our standard of nutrition, everything they will also increase. Okay. The other perspective suggests that no, first you try to enhance the level of education, health, social security measures, then perhaps your per capita income is going to increase. Okay. We don't know practically we are not clear which segment should be manipulated to put the wheel in motion. Okay? Because at least in Indian context, in Asiatic nations, in African nations, in Latin American nations, what we have found that even if the per capita income has increased, the quality of life has not increased. Okay? The physical quality of life index has not increased substantially. Okay? Such approach also implies that the process of development can be initiated through different sectors of the society. Okay? The concept of development has subjective evaluative meaning as well as objective empirical meaning. When I say subjective evaluative meaning or subjective evaluative perspective, that suggests that the concept of development can be viewed as a process of realizing certain goals or values such as improved health and housing, better nutrition, greater communication networks, improved transportation and increased command over resources. This is very important. Okay? Then subjective evaluative perspective emphasizes on certain goals or values, objectives and higher ordered norms, okay, values, okay, such as improved health and housing, better nutrition, greater communication networks, improved transportation and more importantly increased command over resources. Increased command over natural resources, increased command over physical resources, human resources and so on. Okay? On the contrary, objective empirical perspective suggests that more developed and less developed countries can be comparatively studied, and the empirical differences between them can be used to illustrate the meaning of development within quote. Okay. Now let us see. When I said subjective evaluative perspective suggests that the concept of development can be viewed as a process of realizing such goals as improved health and housing, better nutrition, I mean increased command over resources, the literature suggests that earlier notion that nature controls human beings. Okay? That was a part of thinking, that was a part of metaphysical thinking, that nature controls human action. Okay? But subsequently when science has science develops, when we encountered industrial revolution, then critical thinking, modernity, reasoning capacity and so on, what we came to understand that human beings know how to control nature, human beings know how to master over nature. Then there was a shift from faculty of contemplation to faculty of control. In other words, I mean in the metaphysical stage, human beings were supposed to worship nature, human beings were supposed to contemplate on nature without getting into conflict with nature. But in the wake of the industrial revolution and so on, what we have found that human beings started controlling nature. Okay? That is why I said there was a shift from faculty of contemplation to faculty of control. But in the 21st century, you can understand that there is a dialectical relationship between nature and human beings. Nature at times controls human action. Human beings also know how to alter nature for their for greater efficiency, for their survival, for their livelihood and so on. Okay? That is important. That is why I said increased command over resources. Okay? And when I said increased command over resources, I also mean how equitably resources can be distributed and so on. And objective empirical perspective suggests that more developed and less developed countries, they constitute some kind of a binary, some kind of a dichotomy on the basis of certain empirical differences. You may look at the level of literacy rate, you can look at the per capita income, you can look at many other indicators of economic development, that you can say that no, these are the empirical differences or these are the empirical indicators which suggests that this is a more developed country and this is a less developed country. Okay? Now, such comparisons generally focused on variations in per capita income. These are economic variables. Okay? Percentage of the population living in rural and urban areas, percentage of workers in agricultural, industrial and service sectors, primary, secondary and tertiary sectors, the literacy rate and mortality and fertility rates. If you come to sociological variables, apart from such predominantly economic variables, namely per capita income, percentage of the population living in rural and urban areas, percentage of workers in primary, secondary and tertiary sectors, the literacy rate, fertility and mortality rates. Sociological variables, there are certain sociological variables, namely division of labor or specialization, okay? Social differentiation, rationalization of values and modernization of outlook. And there are certain political variables, namely mobilization and participation, how different sections of the society can be mobilized and what is the degree of participation in social and public life. Okay? Participation of the people at large, okay? Cutting across classes, cutting across caste groups, cutting across gender, cutting across races and so on. Okay? Though there may be some degree of autonomy in the subjective evaluative characteristics of development on the one hand and objective empirical characteristics of development on the other, by and large what we generally find that there is a certain degree of coherence among them, implying an integral relationship between the various features of development. Okay? Now, please do not think that subjective evaluative perspective and objective empirical perspective, they constitute some kind of a dichotomy. No. There are certain objective empirical characteristics which have significant implications for subjective evaluative meanings. For example, per capita income. You will find when the per capita income of a country reaches a certain high level, a majority of the population would be living in urban areas, urbanization, and would be working in non-agricultural occupations, and social differentiation would be greater and the value orientation would be more rational, more secular. Okay? Okay. Similarly, subjective evaluative characteristics, they have also significant implications for objective empirical meanings. There would also be features like a high rate of literacy, low rates of mortality and fertility, more gainful employment opportunities, greater satisfaction of basic needs and so on. Okay? Thus, the idea of development in the sense of achieving an ever increasing level of income for the majority of the people in a country is relatively recent. In the past, heads of the state were not expected to provide a regularly rising standard of living for the common people. Ups and downs in the fortunes of society were accepted as being natural, and there was no expectation of regular overall progress. It was in England in the middle of the 18th century that it was first realized that steady material progress was not only possible but also desirable. Okay? That is why we are going to discuss in the next week, okay, end of colonialism, rise of nationalism in the third world and the desire for development. Okay? That steady material growth is not only possible but also desirable to have the questions of inclusion, to have the questions of progress and so on. Okay? Subsequently, the idea of progress, desirable is important, subsequently the idea of progress spread to the other countries. Okay? Now it is becoming very important, idea of progress. Okay? That progress in human condition, progress in socio-economic condition, in political condition, in cultural conditions, there must be progress. Okay? In many countries, nationalism rather than human welfare played a more important role in pushing for development. Okay? Human welfare assumed greater significance in the context of development rather than nationalism. Okay? In many countries. Okay? The recent widespread concern with economic development may be traced to the Second World War, which necessitated a moral basis. That why moral basis is important in the context of, or ethical basis is important in the context of development, that when you look at a country like India, if the rate of hunger death, if the rate of unemployment, if the rate of the people living below the poverty line, if these questions are not addressed, then I think there is some kind of a moral bankruptcy in the formulation of public policy or development policy. Okay? And why I'm trying to look at this moral basis, especially in the context of the Second World War, what we generally find that during and after the Second World War, what we found that the world was then gasping after being ravaged by the horrendous crimes and casualties perpetrated by the Second World War. National economies of most of the countries, both developed as well as developing countries, both colonizers as well as the colonized nations were in tatters. International trade touched the lowest ebb. Such was the situation that called for the reconstruction and development of poor as well as rich countries, and the freedom of the starving population from hunger in the third world was also made its objective. Reconstruction and development, that is very important. Okay? This focused the attention of several agencies and interest groups on the problems of development, and by the end of the Second World War, economic development became a leading topic in academic work both in developed as well as developing countries. Okay? Why I'm referring to specifically reconstruction and development? Precisely because of the way the International Monetary Fund and the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, popularly known as the World Bank, they were established I mean the World Bank's real name is the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development. Okay? And that situation was created to reconstruct and develop the poor countries as well as the rich countries, because both poor as well as rich nations were adversely affected by the horrendous crimes and casualties perpetrated by the Second World War. And that's how we look at the idea of development. We are trying to situate the idea of development historically. Okay? Then when we look at there certain indicators of development, let us start with per capita income. The post Second World War period also witnessed the emergence of questions about the measurement and indicators of development. What may be the possible indicators of development? Is there any probable indicator of development? Then income was first adopted by Pigou, Arthur Cecil Pigou, a neoclassical economist. He first adopted income as an indicator of welfare and well-being. Pigou described economic welfare as a measurable part of human welfare. Income was also used to record economic activities, particularly the production of goods and services already achieved. If you look at per capita income is equal to, how to calculate this? Per capita income is equal to total personal income divided by the total population. I mean, to calculate per capita income, one must first know the total personal income and the total population for the area in which one wants to determine the per capita income. Okay? This must be clear. Okay? This is how generally per capita income is calculated. Total personal income divided by total population of that particular area. Though the pioneers of measuring calculating national income and output were concerned with its importance for social welfare too. In the course of time, increase in national income became the main focus of measuring development, and development began to be indicated and understood in terms of per capita income. That was Pigou's model, how Pigou tried to adopt income as an indicator of welfare and well-being, and how Pigou described economic welfare as a measurable part of human welfare. That's how to calculate national income, to calculate national output, the pioneers of measuring national income and output were concerned with its importance for social welfare. But in the course of time, increase in national income became the main focus of measuring development, and development began to be indicated and understood in terms of per capita income. With the identification of development with a rise in national income, gross national product, national income GNP, and its other derivatives like per capita income, increase in GNP, gross national product, became the goal of development. And with this, the importance of promoting individual welfare receded. Now, what Pigou thought, that no, economic welfare must look into the aspect of human welfare, started declining. The way development policy has been framed over a period of time, that you tend to look at only national income, GNP, and its other derivatives, including per capita income, that there is a renewed emphasis only on gross national product. That has become the goal of development today. And when GNP, when increase in GNP has become the objective of development policy, perhaps the importance to promote individual welfare is on decline today, has receded. Okay? It was assumed that well-being would follow automatically from economic growth. The resulting emphasis on increase in per capita income as the main goal of development led to a certain insensitivity in the pattern of distribution of national income. Our national income is increasing, our gross national product is increasing, but our quality of life is not on the rise. Then perhaps the rise in national income, the rise in gross national product has not been equitably distributed among different sections of the population in our country or in the world. In the course of time, the problem of distribution of income was altogether forgotten. It was assumed that in the process of development, income would trickle down to various sections of the society. Okay? There is nothing called magic that it will trickle down. Okay? That was thought that no, when national income, when gross national product would increase, such income would trickle down to various sections of the society, which has never happened. Okay? And which is never going to happen also, because there is nothing called magic here. Okay? Because unless and until you equitably distribute your income and resources among various sections of the society, okay, it is not going to trickle down. Okay? It was thought that no, income would ultimately trickle down to various sections of the society. Thus, income in its per capita form moved from a partial monetary measure of well-being to the center stage as an indicator of welfare. As if income increases, our welfare will also increase, which does not happen that way. With increase in national income, particularly per capita income, becoming the leading criterion of development, the main effort in developmental activities turned from measures for increasing national and per capita income, believing that this would enable each individual to consume more. And this made the rise in national income the predominant concern of developmental activities, and development was understood as a process by which the economy was transformed from one whose rate of growth of per capita income was small or negative to one in which a significant self-sustained rise in per capita income was a permanent long-run feature. Okay? Thus, per capita income was considered, even today it is considered as an indicator of development. Then another indicator of development is included here in this discussion, that is structure of the economy and workforce. It was recognized quite early that an increase in per capita income would lead to a structural transformation of the economy, culture and polity, economy and society as such. With economic development and increased per capita income, the share of the manufacturing and service sectors of the economy expanded and that of the agricultural sector shrunk. As a result, economically underdeveloped societies had a larger proportion of the labor force in the agricultural sector and a lower proportion in the manufacturing and service sectors, while economically developed countries had a lower proportion of the workforce in the primary or agricultural sector and a larger proportion of the workforce in the secondary, manufacturing sector, and tertiary, service sectors. Okay. This is, that's how more developed and less developed countries have been comparatively studied, and the empirical differences that we tend to see here can be used to illustrate the meaning of development. Okay. The share of the agricultural sector in the national product was also negatively correlated with per capita income, being low in countries with a high per capita income and high in countries with a low per capita income. On the contrary, the share of the manufacturing and service sectors in the national product was high in countries with a high per capita income. Okay? Based on these structural characteristics of the economy, the proportion of the workforce in the primary, secondary and tertiary sectors, agricultural, manufacturing and service sectors, and the relative contribution of these sectors to gross national product were adopted as indicators of economic development. The higher the proportion of the workforce in the secondary and tertiary sectors, and the higher the proportion of these sectors to gross national product, the more developed the country was considered. Inversely, the larger the proportion of the workforce in the primary agricultural sector and the larger its share in the gross national product, the less developed the economy was considered. Okay? That is why once Galbraith said, famous economist, philosopher, that he said that a purely agricultural country is poor even in its agriculture. Okay? That this is important. Okay. Then another indicator of development, that is urbanization, is included here for discussion. That is, the shift in economic structure away from agriculture to industry implied an associated process of urbanization. Dense human settlements with a large proportion of the population in non-agricultural pursuits. In this context, in developed countries, the proportion of the population living in urban areas was more, while in underdeveloped countries, a greater proportion of the people lived in rural areas. Therefore, the proportion of the urban population became another indicator of development. Then saving rate. Because of the predominance of manufacturing activities in developed countries, okay, economic development in the early phase was thought to be synonymous with industrialization. Industrialization required capital for building factories, installing machines and operating the factories, for constructing the infrastructure and various other activities required for the sustenance of manufacturing activities. This led some scholars to identify capital formation as the main vehicle, of economic development. Since capital formation is dependent on the rate of savings, okay, in the community, it became another indicator for measuring development. Okay. Okay. Then it was thought that if your saving rate is more, then you tend to accumulate more and more capital. Once capital gets accumulated, you tend to make your country, your region more industrialized, and once a country is more industrialized, it leads to economic development. That is how it was thought of. Okay. But if you look at today's saving rate, the interest that we generate from the savings, personal savings, is on decline today. That is why perhaps it is very difficult to aim at capital formation today, capital accumulation today. Okay? But what we are doing in the 21st century, how these paradigms are getting displaced by certain other paradigms of development, we will be discussing towards the end of this course. Then education was thought of as an indicator of development historically. In the course of time, it was recognized that human resources played an important role in development, leading to an emphasis on human resource development. It came to be realized that the fundamental problem in development was not the creation of wealth, but the creation of the capacity to create wealth. It is not simply about how wealth can be created, but it is to understand the capacity to create wealth. For example, you look at the works of Amartya Sen and others, Poverty and Inequality, Inequality Re-examined, Development as Freedom. I mean, the entire entitlement approach, I mean, whether one has the capacity to create wealth or not, whether the state has created that scope so that it enables somebody to have to develop a capacity to create wealth or not. That is a capacity which resided in the people of a country, particularly in their intellectual capacity. Investment in human capital was identified to be an important source and result of economic development. The level of education was identified as an indicator of the level of development of human resources, and this led to the adoption of the educational level of the population as another indicator of development. The United Nations Economic and Social Council tried to provide certain welfare characteristics, certain social dimensions of, as part of these welfare characteristics, certain social dimensions of development in terms of personal income, in terms of health, in terms of nutrition, in terms of education, in terms of housing, in terms of employment. Okay? Because when you look at development only in terms of per capita income, perhaps it does not help. Okay? That is why health, nutrition, education, housing, employment, they are extremely important. That is how you will find Scandinavian countries, Sweden, Denmark, Norway, I mean, they have developed enormously precisely because they have emphasized more on these aspects: health, nutrition, education, housing, employment, and so on. The United Nations Research Institute for Social Development further delineated certain welfare characteristics of development in terms of health, I mean demographic conditions, food and nutrition, education in terms of not simply literacy and but also skills, okay, conditions of work, I mean work conditions of work must be conducive for better efficiency, for creativity and so on. Employment situation, that is what when I say employment is extremely important. You cannot have a developed country on the basis of large scale unemployed youth. Okay, you cannot make a country developed with large scale unemployment, with huge unemployment. Okay, when you look at this employment situation, I mean, but on what basis employment can be generated? In the 1930s, when there was Great Depression, 1929 to 1933, the famous economist John Maynard Keynes, he came up with a book. He came up with a solution in the form of a book, The General Theory of Employment, Interest and Money, in 1936. How to look at the question of poverty, how to look at the question of unemployment, how to look at the question of recession, okay, where you will find a large scale unemployment. How are you going to address this problem? He said that a single dose of investment, can create a generation of income as well as employment. Okay? What he meant investment is nothing but public investment, public spending in it's not like private investment, but public investment, state investment. The state must invest in core sectors of the economy to create more income and employment. Okay? Public spending is very important, public investment. Okay? That's what he said, a single dose of investment can create a generation of income and employment as well. Then another welfare characteristic that the United Nations Research Institute for Social Development outlined, that is aggregate consumption and savings. Okay? Transportation, housing facilities, household facilities, clothing, recreation and entertainment, social security and human freedom. Human freedom, I mean freedom of speech, freedom of expression, freedom to express your differences, freedom to dissent. Okay? That's what the United Nations Research Institute for Social Development outlined the welfare characteristics of development in terms of health, food and nutrition, education, conditions of work, employment situation, aggregate consumption and savings, transportation, housing, I mean household facilities, clothing, recreation, entertainment, social security and human freedom. Okay? When you have this creativity, more efficiency, but our human potentiality must be realized, must be fulfilled. The experience of the social consequences of planned development in the third world led to a reappraisal of the objectives of development. In the early 1960s, Dudley Sears emphasized that development was basically a normative concept. It's a norm-bound concept. It's a prescriptive concept. That this kind of normative concept is synonymous with improvement, and its objective was to create appropriate conditions for the realization of the full potential of the human personality. Dudley Sears therefore stressed that development was to be understood and calculated in terms of reduction of poverty, reduction in employment and reduction of inequality, and not through growth of GNP or per capita income. You may have a rise in gross national product or per capita income, but if in your country poverty, unemployment and inequality has not been reduced, then that is not a developed country. Okay? Dudley Sears further argues that gross national product can grow without any improvement in any of these criteria. Gross national product, national income, per capita income, they may grow, they may increase without any improvement in the case of poverty, in the case of unemployment, in the case of inequality and so on. Okay? That is why human potentiality must be realized. To be chronically, what Dudley Sears, let me quote Dudley Sears here, that to be chronically dependent upon another person, even for food, was incompatible with self-respect, was incompatible with human dignity. For a non-senile adult, especially for somebody who was preparing for an economically active life. Then thus equity became another indicator of development. Both poverty and unemployment are associated in various ways with income, but even a rapid increase in per capita income in itself would not be enough to reduce either poverty or unemployment. Poverty can be eliminated much more rapidly if any given rate of economic growth is accompanied by a declining concentration of incomes. Equity should be considered an objective of development. Then therein lies the significance of instrumental rationality. That equity should be considered an objective of development. It should be a goal-oriented social action, it must be an objective-oriented social action, it must be an aim-oriented social action, and this goal-oriented social action or objective-oriented social action or aim-oriented social action is alternatively known as instrumental rationality. And the social barriers and inhibitions of an unequal society distort the personalities of those with high incomes as it distorts the personalities of those who are poor. Therefore, a plan or program which contains no measures for reducing poverty, unemployment and inequality can hardly be considered to contribute to development. The realization of human potential also requires adequate educational levels, especially literacy, participation in the government and belonging to a nation that is truly independent both economically as well as politically. As undernourishment, unemployment and inequality dwindle, educational and political goals become more significant objectives of development. Another indicator of development is suggested here, that is physical quality of life index, PQLI, physical quality of life index. I mean, even in a monetized economy, gross national product may increase over time without improving well-being. That's what Morris argued. The poorest groups of society may not benefit much or not at all from rising national income alone. On the contrary, a country can be made better off in terms of social security, social harmony, longevity of life and mortality rates through appropriate programs without any increase in gross national product. Morris therefore emphasized that the objective of development should be the satisfaction of essential human needs along with increasing the output of goods and services. This required a mix of policies that would react and reinforce one another. Okay? Physical quality of life index is based on three indicators. One is life expectancy rate, secondly infant mortality rate and thirdly literacy rate. I mean, physical quality of life index suggests that your life expectancy rate must be high. At the same time, infant mortality rate must be kept to the minimum and literacy rate must be very high. In this, why? I mean, then your medical systems, your science and technology must have reached a level where you will find that there is a less more infant mortality rate. There is growing awareness about fertility as well as mortality. old age people, they must have a decent, must have an improved, must have improved health condition, and your educational levels must be pretty high. Okay. Human Development Index further suggests that development as a process of enlarging people's choices, preferences. That's what the United Nations Development Program in 1990, UNDP, suggested, that you look at the Human Development Index. You must consider Human Development Index as one of the indicators of development. That is a process of enlarging people's choices. That development is based on a long and healthy life, expansion of the forms of knowledge, systems of knowledge, and there must be an increase in resources for a decent standard of living. These are very important. If people's choices are not getting enlarged, if people's choices are not getting expanded, then what kind of a life that we are leading? Okay. Okay, that's what the UNDP, the United Nations Development Program in 1990 suggested. The sociological indicators, that's why suggest that development affects the structure and character of societies in many ways. Transformation in the occupational structure and urbanization, which occur with economic development, are also indicators of sociological transformation in society. Comparative studies of developed and more developed and less developed societies show significant differences in their mortality and fertility rates. If you look at developed countries, you will find there is low mortality rate as well as low fertility rate. But if you look at a less developed society, then you will find there is more fertility rate as well as more mortality rate. Okay? While developed societies are characterized by low mortality and low fertility rates, less developed societies are characterized by high mortality as well as high fertility rates. As societies develop, their social structure becomes increasingly complex. Simple societies are characterized by a simple social organization based on kinship. Nevertheless, with development, these such traditional social organizations disintegrate, separating economic behavior from the social, and division of labor or specialization increases, and social differentiation and social stratification emerge. More developed and less developed societies are distinct in many aspects of their culture. The evolution of universalistic values and norms is an important feature of developed societies, and this is reflected in the institutionalization of a general legal system applicable to all sections of society rather than to a few functional or segmental sectors. As societies develop, the personality of their members undergoes a fundamental transformation. They reject passivity, resignation and fatalism and develop empathy, that cognitive empathy, understanding the need of the other, understanding the role of the other, and they become independent of traditional authority and develop instrumental attitudes and behavior, goal oriented. Okay. Coming to political indicators of development, I mean, one must look at nation building. Nation building cannot be studied in isolation. Okay. Nation building must be examined in the context of rise in human welfare, okay, establishment of legal institutions, organization of political life and performance of political functions in accordance with the standards expected of a modern nation state. Okay. Spread of rationality in administration, strengthening of secular and legal concepts, application of specialized knowledge in the solution of human affairs, rational and responsible government behavior, political stability, participation of the deprived sections of the society in socio-political processes, mobilization of the marginalized and powerless sections of the society. And that's how Liebenstein, Harvey Liebenstein mentions the various features of developing societies in terms of economic characteristics, agricultural characteristics, demographic characteristics, cultural and political characteristics, technological characteristics, and so on. Adelman and Morris suggested sociocultural characteristics, political characteristics, and economic characteristics. We have discussed all these things. I mean, in backward economies are characterized by low per capita income and low productivity in agriculture. That's what we have discussed. A very high proportion in agriculture, usually around 50 to 80%. Absolute overpopulation in agriculture. There is seasonal unemployment. There is disguised unemployment, where disguised unemployment, I mean the marginal product will be either zero or negative. And a lack of employment opportunities outside agriculture, very little utilization of capital per head, and primitive agricultural techniques. I mean the same bullock cart system, very low rate of savings. Primary industries are usually residual employment categories, agriculture, forestry, mining, and so on. The output of agriculture, which dominates the economy, is made up mostly of cereals and primary raw materials with a relatively low output and output of animal protein. A major proportion of household expenditure is on food and other basic necessities. The export sector is dominated by food items and raw materials, a very low volume of trade per capita, poor facilities for credit and marketing, poor housing condition of the general population, poor development of physical overhead capital, an ineffective tax system and financial institutions, and poorly developed human resources. And low per capita income in underdeveloped countries is a reflection of low productivity in economic activities, particularly agriculture, in which you will find almost 40-50% of the population is engaged. And low productivity in agriculture and other activities is mainly due to the utilization of simple technology, the use of tools and equipment of low productivity, a low level of utilization of capital, and a low level of human capacity to use resources more productively. That's I mean, when I say primitive agriculture, limited use of capital, low use of inputs, and low level of consumption. I mean limited use of capital, when I say in primitive agriculture, very little capital is used either per unit of land or per laborer. Generally, there is little improvement of land through leveling, bunding of canals and drainage. The use of tools is limited, and the few tools that are used in productive activities are of a very primitive kind. Very often, the tools used for preparing the soil are limited to a wooden plough or a small hoe, and weeding and harvesting are generally done hand or with a small sickle. When I mean threshing is done manually by beating the ear heads, pounding them with a stick, or by animals treading on them. Similarly, winnowing and transportation of the produce to the granary are also done by primitive means. Irrigation, an essential requirement for efficient agricultural production, may not be possible for most of the farmers due to the lack of capital to dig wells, install pumps, and dig channels. Even where tanks and ponds are available, water may be lifted and thrown into the field with a reed basket by a pair of workers, or it may be lifted with a moat or worked with water well. These are all examples of the very limited use of technology and capital in the organization of agricultural production in underdeveloped economies. When I say low use of inputs, I mean backward economies are characterized by extensive rather than intensive agriculture. In such a production system, the use of various inputs including labor is very low. Such a poor use of labor and other inputs is the outcome of a variety of factors, such as the lack of awareness of the technology of intensive agriculture. Peasants in I mean, for example, if you look at for intensive cropping, the peasants should be aware of the importance of soil preparation, methods of chemically treating seeds before sowing, regular irrigation and drainage of fields, weeding the fields at regular intervals, applying insecticides, protecting crops from rodents, proper storing of the produce after harvesting. I mean, peasants in backward economies lack this kind of knowledge, resulting in the low utilization of even the abundantly available human labor in agricultural production, and as a result, even in a situation where labor remains unemployed, its absorption into agricultural activities was very low. While the use of capital in agriculture is very low, there is an uneconomic use of whatever capital exists due to the exceedingly small size of plots and for fragmentation of holdings. This results in low yields and low earnings from agriculture, in which most of the population is engaged. As a result, most of the population is unable to consume anything beyond their bare subsistence requirements, thus making these societies predominantly subsistence oriented. Low level of consumption, when I said, I mean the low productivity and meager earnings of the workers often make household earnings fall short of subsistence requirements. Undernourishment and debilitation adversely affect the capacity of the rural population to work hard for a full day, resulting in low earnings and low productivity, and thus a vicious circle emerges, creating a relation between poor agricultural development and poor human development, between an underdeveloped economy on the one hand and an underdeveloped society on the other. Low standard of living you will find, I mean in the context of developing society, developing economy, I mean in terms of poor hygiene, high fertility, high mortality, low human development, I mean low investment in education, low demand for skills, hunger for land. The traditional non-agricultural sector is predominant, traditional markets are there, low level of differentiation, predominance of particularism, dualism, extended family, absence of a middle class, lack of social cohesion, traditional orientation, limited vision, lack of community consciousness and passivity, and you will find that there is an integration of a population into a community, okay, on the basis of religion, on the basis of caste, on the basis of race, on the basis of tribe. I mean creation of a sense of national unity, emergence of specialized political structures having functionally distinct regulatory roles, increase in governmental efficiency in utilizing the human and material resources of the polity for national goals. And there is fragmentation on the basis of religion, caste, race, ethnicity, language, religion, insecurity, gender and so on. Okay. What we have discussed in this lecture, we have discussed, I mean in the first lecture and in the second lecture we have covered historical location of the idea of within quote development, and in the next week what we are going to discuss end of colonialism, rise of nationalism in the third world and the desire for within quote development. Thank you.